At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the in-depth presentation webinar on the designated use requirements in the Water Quality Standards Regulatory Revisions Final Rule. My name is Shari Barish from the EPA's Office of Water, Office of Science and Technology, located in EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Manjali Volkin and Janita Aguirre of my office will provide some of today's presentation and will help address your clarifying questions. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise during today's webinar. Before we proceed, let me go over some logistical information. We are using EPA's Adobe Connect service for today's webinar. You should be able to see the presentation on your screen now. You have two options for hearing today's presentation. If you have computer speakers or headphones, you should be able to hear the presentation through your computer system. If you do not have speakers or headphones, you can connect to the audio portion of this presentation by dialing 1-866-299-3188. Once prompted, enter in code 202-566-1149 and then hit the pound key. You only need to use one of these options to access the audio portion of today's call. If you use both speakers, computer speakers, and dial into the phone line, you will hear feedback. If you experience any technical difficulties during this webinar, you may click the Help button at the top of your screen, or you may contact us for assistance by typing your issue in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. This webinar and the Q&A session on Thursday are the last of a series of one-hour webinars EPA has held to inform the public about the Water Quality Standards Regulatory Revisions Final Rule. Today's webinar is being recorded, and EPA intends to post it on our rulemaking website for future viewing. Thursday's webinar will be a one-hour question and answer session where EPA will respond to the submitted questions from you. While today's webinar may allow time to address a few clarifying questions, we encourage you to submit your questions in the chat box or send them to wqsregulatoryclarifications@epa.gov, and EPA can address them at the question and answer session webinar. Please be aware that EPA may not have time to address all questions submitted, and the sooner you submit the question following the presentation webinar, the more likely EPA will be able to address it at the question and answer session. The main purpose of today's webinar is to provide you with in-depth information about the designated uses requirements in the Water Quality Standards Regulatory Revisions Final Rule that was published on August 21st, 2015, which is effective today, October 20th, and to allow you an opportunity to ask clarifying questions. Because today's webinar is informal and EPA is describing the contents of the final Water Quality Standards Regulation, it is important that we are clear that today's webinar does not itself impose any binding requirements, determine any obligations of the regulated community, change or substitute for any statutory provision or regulation requirement, or represent, change, or substitute for any agency policy or guidance. Further, today's discussion does not control any case of conflict between this discussion and the statute, regulation, EPA policy, or guidance. Let's turn now to the presentation on the designated uses requirements in the final rule. Again, you may submit your questions in the chat box, and we will respond to a few today and additional questions during the question and answer session in a couple of days. Manjali? Okay, in today's presentation, we will go over the final rule requirements and key information discussed in the preamble. Our discussion will follow an outline covering four broad questions. First, we will talk about why EPA revised the designated use provisions. Second, we will cover some background concepts before moving into the actual revisions to the regulations to help put the revisions into context. Third, we will move into the actual revisions and discuss what a use attainability analysis, or UAA, when a use attainability analysis, or UAA, is required and when it is not required. EPA made very targeted revisions to these provisions of 131.10, much of which was to improve clarity. We will go over when a UAA is and isn't required in its entirety, even though we only made one substantive revision. Finally, we will go over the highest attainable use requirement, or HAU. Again, we will stop a couple times during the presentation to answer questions. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box as we go through the presentation if a question comes to you. Since the basic structure of the Water Quality Standards Regulation was first established in 1983, the regulation and the resulting state and tribal water quality standards have been a strong force to establishing goals that drive pollution prevention and restoration. Designated uses have specifically served as a solid foundation for a broad range of water quality management programs. However, since 1983, new, more complex challenges have arisen, including extreme weather events, hydrologic alteration, and climate change-related impacts. As a result, there is a need for more effective and practicable approaches to protecting water quality. Of specific importance is designated uses. Because designated uses establish the states and authorized tribes' goal for a water and thus determine the criteria levels needed, it is critical that EPA's regulation helps states and authorized tribes establish and protect designated uses to the best extent possible. Therefore, EPA revised its designated use provisions to serve three broad functions. First, the revision facilitates the establishment of accurate designated uses, which are essential to restoring and protecting water quality to meet the goals and objectives of the Clean Water Act. Second, the revisions improve the process that states and authorized tribes use to designate and revise uses, so that water quality standards serve to restore and maintain resilient water quality and robust aquatic ecosystems. Finally, the regulation is now explicit in areas that previously caused confusion and conflicting interpretations and essentially hindered environmental progress. To understand the impact of EPA's revisions to Part 131, it was important for us to establish standardized terminology. We'll start by using the words of the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act at Section 101A provides that the ultimate objective of the Act to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. The Clean Water Act goes on to distinguish between two broad categories of uses. Those are the uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act and all other uses. As you see on the slide, the Clean Water Act is clear that the national goal is, wherever attainable, water quality which provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife and recreation in and on the water. However, when discussing the establishment of water quality standards, Clean Water Act Section 303C2A says that not only should the use and value of those uses specified in Section 101A2 be taken into consideration, but it identifies public water supply, agricultural, industrial, and navigation uses as additional uses to be considered. 303C2A also directs that such standards shall be such as to protect the public health or welfare, enhance the quality of water, and serve the purposes of this Act. What does this mean for water quality standards? EPA has implemented the Clean Water Act to distinguish between three different types of designated uses. We explain this in detail in the preamble to the final rule, but we will spend a little time going over the terms here. First, the Clean Water Act identified very clearly those uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act, and these are the national goal. This means that the national goal is to provide for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water, wherever attainable. Because the Clean Water Act also says that at Section 303C2A, are to protect public health and welfare, EPA interprets the Clean Water Act to mean that not only can the fish and shellfish thrive in a water body, but when caught, they can also be safely eaten by humans. States have adopted uses such as aquatic life uses, recreation uses, and consumption uses. Second, by specifying the goal is the uses specified in Section 101A2 as where attainable, the Clean Water Act recognizes that such uses may not be fully attainable. A subcategory of a use specified in Section 101A2 of the Act is any use that reflects a subdivision of the uses specified in 101A2 of the Act for the purpose of reducing variability. Examples of such uses include warm water aquatic life, cold water aquatic life, shellfish harvesting use, primary contact recreation, and secondary contact recreation uses. As you can see, some of these subcategories are considered to be fully meeting the Section 101A2 use, while others are less protective. Lastly, we have all the uses that were specified in Clean Water Act Section 303C2A, but not in Clean Water Act Section 101A2. What do we call those uses? Well, as you might have guessed, we call them non-101A2 uses. To be clear, non-101A2 uses are not uses that don't fully meet the national goal of Section 101A2, like a limited aquatic life use or secondary contact recreation use. Those are subcategories of uses specified in Section 101A2. Rather, non-101A2 uses are uses that are not related to the protection or propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, or recreation in or on the water. Examples of these are public water supply, agriculture, industrial, and navigation uses. EPA specifically added this definition to the regulation at 131.3Q. Since 1983, EPA's Water Quality Standards Regulation interprets and implements the Clean Water Act provisions by requiring that water quality standards protect the uses specified in Clean Water Act Section 101A2, unless a state or authorized tribe shows that those uses are unattainable. The mechanism by which a state or authorized tribe would rebut this presumption that the uses specified in Section 101A2 are attainable is a use attainability analysis. A use attainability analysis, or a UAA, is defined at 131.3G as a structured scientific assessment of the factors affecting the attainment of the use, which may include physical, chemical, biological, and economic factors as described in Section 131.10G. EPA's regulations at 131.10 describe when and how a UAA can be conducted to rebut the presumption and to remove or revise a designated use. These regulations include 6 specific factors at 131.10G that can be used when demonstrating that a use is not attainable. It is important to remember that this concept of rebutting the presumption of attainability does not automatically designate any uses for a state or tribe, and thus does not take away the primary role of states and authorized tribes to designate uses. It only means that states and authorized tribes must designate uses after weighing evidence regarding the availability of the uses specified in Section 101A2. If a state or authorized tribe finds that the uses specified in Section 101A2 are not attainable, the regulations provide a clear pathway to demonstrating why they are not attainable and then designating other uses. Designated uses are only effective for Clean Water Act purposes after a state or authorized tribe has adopted them and EPA has approved them as water quality standards, or after EPA goes through a formal rulemaking to promulgate new or revised designated uses for the state or tribe. To interpret the wherever attainable language of the Clean Water Act, EPA's regulation established the UAA process to identify where such uses are not attainable, including the 6 factors that can be used to demonstrate a use is not attainable. Designated uses focus on what is attainable in the future. Therefore, the UAA to remove a use is a prospective analysis that involves identifying the current and expected condition for a water. In other words, as part of a UAA, states and authorized tribes need to consider not only what is currently attained, but also what is attainable in the future after achievable gains in water quality are realized. This analysis involves identifying the current and expected condition for the water body, evaluating the effectiveness of best management practices and associated water quality improvements, examining the efficacy of treatment technology through engineering studies and using water quality models, loading calculations, and other predictive tools. In our final background slide, let's discuss the two restrictions on removing a use that have existed since 1983. First, EPA's regulation has been clear since 1983 that a designated use cannot be removed if doing so would also remove an existing use. This provision is to ensure that we continue to maintain water quality and uses already achieved rather than moving backwards. Second, the use cannot be removed if it could be attained by the imposition of technology-based effluent limitations and cost-effective and reasonable BMPs, or best management practices, for non-point source controls. The purpose of this provision is to maintain the technology-based requirements as the minimum floor and to ensure that states and authorized tribes are not giving up on the Clean Water Act goal too easily without considering the whole spectrum of actions that could be taken to meet the Clean Water Act goals. Although EPA did not make any revisions to the regulation pertaining to existing uses, EPA does discuss existing uses in detail in the preamble to the final rule. EPA's regulation at 131.10J describes when a UAA is required. EPA's revisions to 131.10J were only to make clear the original intent of the 1983 regulation. However, to provide you with a complete picture, I'll go over when a UAA is required. A UAA is required when a state is designated uses for the first time that do not include the uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act. That is, when a state or authorized tribe designates non-101A2 uses or subcategories of the uses specified in 101A2 of the Act that do not protect the full 101A2 uses for a water body that previously had no designated uses assigned. Sometimes these are referred to as unclassified waters. A UAA is also required when a state has previously designated uses that do not include the uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act. Although such situations may be rare 30-plus years after the regulation was adopted, they can still occur in present day, such as where a tribe may have designated waters prior to obtaining treatment in a manner similar to a state. A UAA is also required when removing either a use specified in Section 101A2 or removing a subcategory of such a use. A UAA is also required when designating a subcategory of a use specified in Section 101A2 that requires criteria less stringent than previously applicable. EPA added the language "than previously applicable" because without such language, there has been confusion regarding to what the criteria should be compared. Now let's talk about when a UAA is not required. The purpose of EPA's revisions to 131.10K was twofold. First, it was to ensure that these provisions are inverses of 131.10J to avoid any situations where there could be a conflict. Therefore, 131.10K1 is the inverse of 131.10J1 and says that a state is not required to conduct a UAA when it designates for the first time or has previously designated for a water body uses that include the uses specified in 101A2 of the Act. 131.10K2 is the inverse of 131.10J2 and says that a UAA is not required where a state designates a subcategory of a use specified in Clean Water Act Section 101A2 that requires criteria at least as stringent as previously applicable. EPA also added a provision to make explicit that a UAA is not required to remove or revise a non-101A2 use. As discussed before, a non-101A2 use is a use that is not related to the protection or propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, or recreation in or on the water. EPA established this as a formal definition for non-101A2 uses in its final regulation. It was clear from comments received on EPA's proposal that our rule was not clear what was required when removing or revising a non-101A2 use. Recognizing that 13110A says that states must take into consideration uses such as non-101A2 uses, this language did not provide guidance on how states are to document their consideration. EPA thus added language to 13110A to say, if adopting new or revised designated uses other than the uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act, or removing designated uses, states must submit documentation justifying how their consideration of the use and value of water for those uses listed in this paragraph appropriately supports the state's action, and a use attainability analysis may be used to satisfy this requirement. As discussed earlier, Clean Water Act Section 101A2 specifically distinguishes between the two uses, and so does EPA's implementation of the Clean Water Act. As a result of this implementation, 13110J and 13110K narrows the need for when the specialized analysis of a UAA must be conducted to the uses specified in Section 101A2. The language in 13110A requires what we now call a use and value demonstration when removing designated uses or when adopting or revising any use other than the uses specified in Clean Water Act Section 101A2. This language is important because it makes clear that such a demonstration is not required when a state is, in fact, adopting a use specified in Section 101A2 of the Act. 13110A still recognizes that non-101A2 uses are important and worthy of protection and careful consideration, but it also accounts for the nature and variety among the non-101A2 uses that justifies more flexibility for states and authorized tribes to describe the use and value of such uses after public participation. EPA's preamble and rule further recognize that while the factors in 13110G may be helpful to guide a state's or authorized tribe's consideration of non-101A2 uses, and provides that a UAA may qualify as a use and value demonstration, states and authorized tribes are not limited to using these attainability factors when making decisions about designating and removing or revising non-101A2 uses. EPA provides more discussion in its response to comments document. When removing or revising a non-101A2 use, it is important to work closely with the EPA regional offices to develop the appropriate use and value demonstration for the designated use in question. The relevant requirements of 13110 still apply to removing or revising a non-101A2 use. But while the 13110G factors are not required, states and authorized tribes should consider additional factors when justifying how their consideration of the use and value of water for the non-101A2 use appropriately supports the state's action. EPA's preamble discusses 4 possible areas to consider when deciding what to include in documentation. The first is relevant descriptive information. For example, the location of the water body or water body segments, an overview of land use patterns, a summary of the available water quality data, stream surveys, physical information about the water body, and information provided by the public. Second is attainability information. Again, the attainability factors at 13110G are not required. However, that doesn't mean that attainability may not be an important consideration for the use and value. For non-101A2 uses, states are just
not limited to those 6 factors. Whether or not a use can actually be attained, even for reasons other than those in 131.10g, may have a significant bearing on whether there is a use and value for that water to remain designated for that use. But, where applicable, the 131.10g factors are a good place to start when considering attainability. Third is the value and benefits associated with either retaining or removing the use. This can include environmental, social, cultural, or economic value and benefits. It could even be a combination. Finally, it is important to look at the impact of the use removal on other designated uses. It is possible that removing protection for a non-101A2 use could actually make attaining another designated use more difficult. This does not mean that the use cannot be removed. However, there may be an interrelation that warrants deciding whether other changes are needed to the water quality standards to be able to remove the non-101A2 use in a least disruptive way. As an example, if there is a parameter that is associated with a non-101A2 use that also impacts a use specified in 101A2, it would be important to adopt a criterion for that parameter to protect the use specified in 101A2 before removing the non-101A2 use. The preamble to the final rule provides an example of how a state may develop a use and value demonstration for removing a public water supply use. You may find this example on page 51027 of the final rule FR notice.
Let's stop now to take a couple of clarifying questions today. We haven't had any in the chat box, so if you have questions, start typing. As a reminder, we'll address many more of your clarifying questions on Thursday's question and answer session webinar. You can email any additional questions to wqs.regulatory-clarifications@epa.gov. So should we pause for a moment and allow people to submit questions? And if not, we'll go on. I see that someone's typing a question now, but for the sake of keeping time, we'll move on, and then we'll take those questions that come in now at the next break.
Okay.
Janita.
Thank you. The concept of highest attainable use is fundamental to the Water Quality Standards Program. If the purpose of the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, then it is critical that states and authorized tribes adopt water quality standards that continue to serve the Act's goal of water quality that provides for the uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Clean Water Act to the extent attainable and enhance the quality of the water. EPA's regulation at 131.10g now makes clear that while states and authorized tribes may remove unattainable uses, they must retain and designate the attainable uses, more specifically, the highest attainable use. Before we go into the regulatory definition of highest attainable use, please take a moment to think about how you would define the highest attainable use. In its simplest terms, one could define highest attainable use as the best that you can accomplish. With that simple plain language definition in mind, it might make sense that adopting anything else could result in the adoption of water quality criteria that inappropriately lowers water quality in such a way that could adversely affect aquatic ecosystems and the health of the public recreating in and on such waters. In other words, it could actually move us further away from the purposes of the Clean Water Act. For example, let's say that a state or authorized tribe can adequately demonstrate that attaining a fully protected and propagating aquatic life use is unattainable because a particular class of aquatic life cannot be protected. However, some less sensitive aquatic organisms are able to survive and even propagate at that site under current or future attainable conditions. If a state chooses to remove the aquatic life use without adopting another aquatic life use in its place, even a limited aquatic life use to at least protect what can be attained, then the state or authorized tribe's water quality standards are not continuing to serve the goals of the Clean Water Act. Now let's talk about the actual regulatory language that EPA finalized. First, EPA revised 131.10g to simply say that if a state adopts a new or revised water quality standard based on a required use attainability analysis, the state shall also adopt the highest attainable use as defined in 131.10m. No, 131.3m. It is important to note that the regulatory language says based on a required use attainability analysis. As we discussed before, a UAA may be an invaluable tool for removing or revising a non-101A2 use. However, a UAA for a non-101A2 use is not required. Thus, a state or authorized tribe is not required to adopt the highest attainable use when removing a non-101A2 use. Let's next move on to the official regulatory definition of the highest attainable use. The definition of the highest attainable use is the modified aquatic life, wildlife, or recreation use that is both closest to the uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act and attainable, based on the evaluation of the factors in 131.10g that preclude attainment of the use and any other information or analyses that were used to evaluate attainability. Remember, as we discussed earlier, a UAA is a prospective analysis looking at both current and future attainable conditions. There are two distinct phrases that I'd like to point out to you. The first is modified aquatic life, wildlife, or recreation use. And the second is based on the evaluation of the factors in 131.10g that precludes attainment of the use and any other information or analyses that were used to evaluate attainability. These are two phrases that were very consciously put into the definition based on public comments. So we'll spend some time going over their purpose and its effect on the definition of HAU. After our proposal, we received many comments that expressed confusion regarding what we meant by highest attainable uses. Some thought that we were suggesting that states and authorized tribes had to pick the one and only use out of all of their uses to protect, as if all the uses in the water quality standards form some sort of hierarchical structure. This is not true. A state is not required to determine whether their aquatic life uses are more important or higher than their recreation uses. Rather, we intended the highest attainable use to refer to another use within the same broad use category if such a use was attainable. We added the term modified to make clear that we mean the highest attainable use is the modified aquatic life use, or the modified wildlife use, or the modified recreation use, depending on the designated use that's being removed. As an example, if a state or tribe is conducting a UAA to remove a warm water aquatic life use, then the highest attainable use would be a modified aquatic life use, or the highest aquatic life use that is attainable. An example might be a limited aquatic life use. In this situation, the HAU requirement would not affect any other designated use in the state's or authorized tribe's water quality standards. We also received comments that our previous language was too subjective because it said that the HAU would be determined using best available data and information. In response, EPA rewrote this portion of the definition to more explicitly articulate our original intent. The HAU is determined based on the evaluation of the factors in 131.10g that preclude attainment of the use and any other information or analyses that were used to evaluate that attainability. We believe this language accurately reflects the objective analysis of the UAA information to determine the HAU. Consider a situation where a state demonstrates that an aquatic life use cannot be attained due to substantial and widespread economic and social impacts. This would be a factor 6 at 131.10g6. When determining the highest attainable use, the state would determine the highest aquatic life use that can be attained without causing such substantial and widespread impact. It is important to note that EPA's requirements do not mean that the highest attainable use is determined by the use that requires the most stringent criteria. Neither the Clean Water Act nor the regulation require states and authorized tribes to adopt designated uses to protect a level beyond what is naturally occurring in the water body. Therefore, a state's or authorized tribe's determination of the HAU must take into consideration the naturally expected condition for the water body or the water body segment. If a water body is naturally expected to achieve a warm water aquatic life use, then a cold water aquatic life use would never be the highest attainable use that must be designated, even though it has more stringent or highest temperature criterion of all the aquatic life uses. EPA's preamble to the proposed rule provided 3 specific examples for how a state or authorized tribe might articulate the HAU and its water quality standards. First, the state or tribe can adopt a use from its set of refined designated uses that are already adopted into regulation. Second, it could revise the current designated use structure to include more refined uses and or subcategories of uses. This might be useful where the state or authorized tribe anticipates the HAU of other waters to be similar. Third, the state may designate a location-specific use and the criteria to protect that use. EPA provided a 4th method in the preamble to its final rule. In this case, rather than identifying tailored designated uses, the state or authorized tribe could just identify the best pollutant or parameter level that can be achieved in that water and adopt it along with a broadly defined highest attainable use such as limited aquatic life use. Doing so is reasonable because it essentially says that the highest attainable use is whatever use is attained when the most protective attainable criteria are achieved. Where a state or authorized tribe does not already have a statewide use in their regulation that is protective of the highest attainable use, the state or authorized tribe will need to find an approach that meets the requirements of the Clean Water Act and 131.10g. States and tribes are not limited by the examples we just talked about. They can choose a different approach that aligns with their specific needs as long as their preferred approach is protective of the HAU and consistent with the Clean Water Act and 131.10. Once a state or authorized tribe has determined the highest attainable use, it must also adopt the water quality criteria that protects the highest attainable use, just as it would for any adopted designated use. The state and authorized tribe's responsibility is to adopt the criteria that protects that use, not to necessarily adopt the highest attainable criteria. But any such criteria must be based on sound scientific rationale. In conclusion, I'd like to go over the key messages from this presentation. First, UAAs are specialized analyses that support the removal or revision of uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act and subcategories of such uses. UAAs may be valuable, but are not required when removing non-101A2 uses. Such uses are removed using a use and value demonstration, and UAAs can satisfy this requirement. Second, it is important to get the uses right in order to ensure that waters are adequately and appropriately protected. UAAs are a specific mechanism for the uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act and subcategories of such uses. But as long as those UAAs are credible and defensible, whether the UAA brings more or less protective criteria is not relevant to EPA's approval decisions. Third, UAAs can be simple or complex. It depends on the specific situation. Fourth, when adopting a new or revised water quality standard based on a required UAA, states and tribes shall adopt the highest attainable use. And finally, states and authorized tribes should engage early and often with EPA when adopting new or revised designated uses. There is no one-size-fits-all water quality standards revision, and the best way to revise water quality standards and designated uses will depend upon many case-specific details, so it is best to collaborate with EPA in order to revise water quality standards consistent with the Clean Water Act and regulation.
Okay, thank you, Janita. Let's stop now and take a couple of clarifying questions today. As a reminder, we will address many more of your clarifying questions on Thursday's question and answer session webinar. Please email any additional questions to wqs.regulatoryclarifications@epa.gov. Manjali, what's the first question for us today?
So the first question we'll answer is whether it says, does EPA have to approve a use and value demonstration or determination, or does the state just submit it with no approval needed from EPA? So removing or revising a non-101A2 use is a new or revised water quality standard that requires EPA action just like removing any other use. So a use and value demonstration is akin to a UAA in that it informs EPA's approval or disapproval of the action. EPA does not review and approve or disapprove a UAA, and at the same also does not review and approve or disapprove the use and value demonstration. Those use and value demonstrations should be submitted as documentation to support the state's water quality standard revision.
Okay. Let's go to the next question.
Sure. So the next question is, if the state's current water quality standards are the result of 50 years of piecemeal changes and updates, can the state simply start from scratch and adopt an entirely new set of water quality standards without conducting innumerable UAAs? So this is an interesting question. I would say that I think most, if not all, state standards are a result of iterative changes over the last however many years. So it's honestly, it's unclear why a state would want to or need to start from scratch. However, the triennial review requirements at 13120A do say that a state shall re-examine any water body segment with water quality standards that do not include the uses specified in Section 101A2, and where such uses are attainable, they should or they must modify their standards appropriately. Now, where a state changes the use, but the criteria is at least as stringent as previously applicable, there is no UAA required, as is clearly specified in 13110K2. So whether or not a UAA would be required if a state was adopting or revising or adopting new uses would really depend upon what's happening with the criteria at the same time.
Great. Okay, I'm going to take the next question. The question is, it seems as though a use and value demonstration is similarly, hold on, my thing is scrolling.
Here, I'll read it for
yes,
you.
Read it for me.
It seems as though a use and value demonstration is similarly detailed as a UAA. How is it more efficient to do a use and value demonstration or determination?
Thank you. So really, the distinction is intended to better match our interpretation of the Act. The Act distinguishes 101A2 uses and talks about them where attainable. So the use and value demonstration is not expressly linked to attainability. This means that the demonstration is not limited to the 131.10g factors. It can be related to the value of the water for future use, for example. That said, a use and value demonstration will be case-specific and may be simple or complex, depending on the water body, the uses being removed, and the public's concern regarding the water body. So in the end, there may be more flexibility for the state or tribe to make their case, but it can be simple or complex. States may do a UAA if that makes sense to serve the purposes of this use and value demonstration. Remembering that for non-101A2 uses, even if you do the UAA, the highest attainable use is not applicable.
Okay.
We
have one more question that we can do before we take a break and look at the other ones. The question is, will EPA recommend criteria for HA use? So highest attainable uses are going to be very case-specific. And in some instances, states will already have identified criteria to protect the use because their highest attainable use is another use that's already established in their use structure. Generally, states would do a UAA to determine the highest attainable use and then identify criteria to protect that use, just like they would adopting any other use or for any other subcategory of a use specified in 101A2. So the concept of a highest attainable use and how you adopt criteria to protect that use isn't really different than if a state were going through and has already in the past adopted a limited aquatic life use. EPA does not recommend criteria for limited aquatic life uses. States, when adopting their uses, then identify what criteria would protect their limited aquatic life use. I think what we'll do now is we got several questions all at once. We will put people on mute while we have a chance to read and process those, and we'll be back in a minute.
This is Janita. I'm going to ask the next question to Sherry. So the question is, can you elaborate as to when EPA is willing to accept a UAA instead of a variance? For example, a municipality commits to a long-term program for CSOs, or combined sewer overflows, or stormwater, and modeling shows that the community can't meet the water quality criteria because of upstream sources. Sherry?
Yes. Okay, I think that's a really good question. But really what it's about is the state's intentions for that waters and the public's input on that waters in terms of thinking about a UAA or a variance. The real difference is time. Variances are time limited. And when you make the demonstrations for 101A2 uses for variances, you would be demonstrating the attainability for this period of time. For a use attainability analysis, the time horizon is much longer. And so you have to be able to show that that use is not attainable really for an indefinite period of time. And so the real difference is about what facts you have, what data and information that you can use to support your analysis, and whether or not, in some cases, for example, we have states that have very long-term problems like PCBs or legacy contaminants, but they might want to choose a variance because they don't want to, quote, give up on their use. But in another community, they see that as a very long-term problem, and they're going to do a UAA and establish a highest attainable use, and then continue to work forward anyway, like through their TMDL programs. So again, I think it's really about the state's intentions, and what the public wants for that water body will determine whether you do a UAA or a variance.
We're going to go on hold one more time. Okay, we're back to answer two more questions. This first one is a bit long, so bear with me. It says, can the highest attainable use have assimilative capacity? For example, we have dissolved oxygen objectives for warm water species of 5 milligrams per liter and for cold water species of 7 milligrams per liter. What if we determine that cold water species is not an attainable use, and therefore the highest attainable use ought to be warm water species with an associated criteria of 5 milligrams per liter, but the water body can actually achieve 6 milligrams per liter. Can the HAU be warm water species with 5 milligrams per liter and an assimilative capacity of 1 milligram per liter dissolved oxygen? So this is a very interesting question, and it's one that we thought about. It sounds like in this scenario, the question is how the state or how they might be able to actually retain that assimilative capacity. And there's probably two ways that I can think of off the top of my head that they could do that. One is that, as we've spoken, the criteria has to protect the use. So the regulations are not driving states to adopt the highest attainable criteria. However, one of the approaches that we discussed in the final rule preamble does suggest that a state could adopt the highest attainable criteria for that particular parameter that they wanted and label the use whatever the appropriate use is. So for example, in this example, the state could adopt the highest attainable use of the warm water aquatic life use, or say a DO enriched warm water aquatic life use, and establish the DO level at 6 milligrams per liter. Another option would be for the state to adopt the warm water aquatic life use with its typical 5 milligram per liter criteria, but then protect that assimilative capacity through its anti-degradation process. This might be a good example for the state to work closely with its regional office to decide sort of which is the best approach. I think we're always encouraging states to try and retain any assimilative capacity for any parameter if there is such. The second question will be mentioned in a moment here. The second question is, what is needed to define what modified aquatic life use can be attained? So a modified aquatic life use is a very general label that provides a lot of flexibility for a state to actually define for themselves what they mean by a modified aquatic life use. I mean, a modified aquatic life use is just something other than the full 101A2 level protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife. All that is essentially what our regs require is that the state establish a designated use, that is the highest attainable use, and then adopt criteria to protect that use. So what criteria, so essentially you would, the state would do their use attainability analysis, and after evaluating whatever it is that is precluding attainment of the currently designated use, what is the actual attainable use? And whatever that actual attainable use is would then be described by the state, and the state would identify what criteria is needed to protect that particular use. Okay, we're going to go back on mute as we keep reading. We probably have only a few minutes. We might answer one more question.
Okay, this is Janita. I think we're going to wrap up for today. I see that we have a couple more questions that were submitted in the chat box that are complex, and so we will take a look at those before Thursday and provide a response on Thursday at 1 o'clock during the designated uses question and answer session. Again, if you have any additional questions that come to you after today's presentation, please email them to us at wqsregulatoryclarifications@epa.gov, and we will consider them tomorrow, and then we'll have the Q&A session on Thursday at 1. So with that, I see a couple more people are typing in the chat box, and just know that we will consider those for Thursday's question and answer session. And for now, we will end today's presentation. But if you already have a question working in the chat box, you can go ahead and submit that. That will still get to me. Okay? So with that, we'll end today's call. Thank you.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 5 minutes. The leader has turned lecture off and your lines have been unmuted.